My job today is going to be to talk through the community level of transitioning out of this crisis. And communities across the United States are talking about building back better right now. And as we heard from Tanner, in the case of the Inland Empire, building back better isn't so much about building back, because by the end of this year, we're going to be almost recovered in terms of the employment level in the Inland Empire, as much as it will be building back better, getting some qualitative changes going in the economy of the Inland Empire. They're going to make for a better, more transformational growth machine going forward. And what I want to really focus on today is a placemaking aspect to this post-crisis transition. What can be done with this very strong, dynamic economy that already exists in the Inland Empire to ensure that that economy can be the right character and tenor going forward? And I'm going to do this actually by talking a little bit about sports at the outset. The Inland Empire is a very interesting major metropolitan area in the United States in that, as you can see, it is about as big as a lot of other major league metropolitan areas. Metropolitan areas like Boston and San Francisco and Detroit, which have each 4 major league sports teams. It's bigger than metropolitan areas like Seattle, Denver, and Baltimore, which also have 3, 4, 2 major league sports teams. And it's quite interesting. There you have in the middle, Inland Empire, 0 major league sports teams. If you're a sports fan or anyone who's an ally of the Inland Empire and aspires for this region to join the rest of the leading regions in the United States, you might wonder why this is the case. And surely, if you ask 5 economists, they might give you 5 different answers. Here's the one that I'd really like to focus on. There's no place to put a major league sports team. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean, first off, there's no physical stadium, obviously, to put a major league sports team. This is the closest thing we have in San Bernardino, the AAA baseball stadium, to a major league stadium. It seats 9,000. It would need to seat 3, 4 times that amount of people in order to accommodate a major league team. So obviously there needs to be a stadium to support, infrastructure to support a major league team. But I'm not just talking about infrastructure. I'm talking about the surroundings of the AAA team in San Bernardino, or the surroundings of any other of the region's AAA or AA baseball teams. If you look at those areas, you see that there's nothing like the sort of environment, the sort of dynamic urban environment that you would find in and around major league downtown stadia. And when you look at this from the air, this really comes into focus. There's a lot of underused and blank space in this area right around the San Bernardino Stadium. And of course, this is not to diminish the thrills of a AAA baseball stadium or the minor league baseball in general. What this is to say is that San Bernardino is a turbocharged economy, and generally speaking in the United States, with turbocharged economies, you get major league amenities, major league infrastructures. When you look at a place like Milwaukee, Greater Milwaukee, and Greater Milwaukee being the site of 2 major league sports teams, you find, on one hand, a much smaller region, a significantly smaller region. Once again, Inland Empire is the 13th largest metropolitan area in the United States. Greater Milwaukee is the 39th largest. But at the same time, you find the sort of dense urban environment, or at least denser urban environment, that can accommodate a major league team, and not just a major league team, but a team that can host major downtown gatherings every time the local basketball team plays a playoff basketball game. So they have this thing, downtown Milwaukee. You might have seen it if you were watching NBA basketball this past summer, called the Deer District. Every single day there's a basketball game, whether home or away. People come down, and they fill in. There's overflow capacity to watch on the big screen in the Deer District to support the local Milwaukee Bucks. Once again, the reason why San Bernardino doesn't have a deer district of its own isn't because it isn't big enough. It isn't because the market can't support it. It's because of placemaking. It's because there's not quite the density of services in downtown anywhere in this region that can support a stadium and all the things that go along with the stadium throughout the year. How does the Inland Empire build a major league downtown, or three? We've got three major cities here. Why can't we have three major league downtowns? And Major League Downtown here, of course, stands in not just for a downtown that can support major league teams, which is, of course, very important to many of us, but one that can support major league amenities of other kinds, operas, ballets, symphonies. Why can't the Inland Empire take its place among other major metropolitan areas in the country? And what I want to do as I try to answer this question today is talk in terms of strategic objectives and tactics. The strategic objectives, I will argue, are pretty clear. They're pretty well known by urban economists and urban planners, and those are the twin goals of residential and establishment density. We want lots and lots of people in a relatively small amount of space in our downtown areas, in our urban cores. Now, how we get there is something that is debated more and something slightly more of an art than of a science. But I'm going to give you some examples and some ways we're thinking through building density at the center. And these are establishing anchors, public safety, and producer services. But before we get in there, let's talk a little bit more about density. Let's really drive this point home. Here are a bunch of metropolitan areas that are about the same size as the Inland Empire that all have iconic downtown areas. So Greater San Francisco doesn't really need to be said. We're all aware of the wonderful public spaces there. Greater Seattle by the waterfront, by the farmers market. Greater Tampa Bay, speaking of other championship winning sports teams, after their team won the Super Bowl this year, you saw people convening in downtown areas. Baltimore, Pittsburgh, these are all places that are about as big as the Inland Empire. And they're places that have been able to ascend this density hill. And the density hill isn't necessarily having San Francisco level or Los Angeles level densities throughout the metropolitan areas, but at the very least having places where folks can convene when they want to express their civic pride. So the Inland Empire is big enough to host a major league sports franchise or other major infrastructure, but it's not dense enough. When you look at the metropolitan area size of an Inland Empire versus Seattle or Denver, you see comparable levels, or even you see that the Inland Empire is larger than these peer cities. However, when you look at the downtown of the Inland Empire, and the closest thing we get in terms of population or establishment density to the downtown of the Inland Empire is downtown San Bernardino, what you find is that the Inland Empire, in terms of the density of its downtown, ranks 66th in terms of population density and 119th in terms of establishment density among all metropolitan areas. So it's nothing like the densities that are on offer in Seattle, Denver, and Baltimore, some of its peer cities. Another thing you find is that the Inland Empire lacks top-end density. Here, it seems pretty complicated, but it's not very complicated. It's a cumulative density distribution. It means as you go on the x-axis from more and less dense type of neighborhoods, you are adding to the sum. And by the time you get to 100% in the yellow bars, that's the San Bernardino area, both now and in 2003, you are at much less densities than in the peer cities. Now, what this has to do with, and this ties back to something that Tanner was saying, is the knowledge end of the job space here in the Inland Empire. It's not so much that the Inland Empire does not have high-end knowledge workers, but that more often than not, those workers need to commute in to other areas in order to access those jobs. There's not quite enough of those jobs in the Inland Empire, and by extension, there are not quite enough of those jobs that are demanding density. So when you're thinking about high-end services like legal services or accounting services, those tend to cluster, as we say, in downtown areas. They tend to require more density, and simply because the Inland Empire does not have those jobs, it does not have the demand for the sorts of dense urban environments that we've been celebrating up till now. But we can't just talk about establishment density. It's not just enough for there to be a lot of law offices and accounting offices in a downtown area. You also want the sort of place that people want to be late at night or on the weekends. And what we find when we think both in terms of residential and establishment density is that on average, these tend to go with each other. The more residential density you have, the more establishment density you tend to have, and vice versa. And on this chart, if you think about the top right cities on this chart, those are the cities with the most dynamic downtowns. The New Yorks, the downtown Miamis of this world tend to have high residential density and high establishment density. So this is really, when we're thinking about strategic objectives for placemaking in the Inland Empire, these are really what we're setting our targets on. Now let's talk a little bit more about the benefits of each type of density. On the residential density side, what you want, the reason why you want to bring in more people per square mile in a downtown area is you get more of that 24/7 energy. The sorts of people that are attracted to cities at night tend to be younger and maybe more vital than people who are attracted in the day to work at jobs. So you want to take advantage of that youth and vitality. Same for the demand for arts and music. If you are a believer, as I am, in the power of arts and music to really activate urban space, then you want to attract folks who want to patronize arts and music. Sales tax. People are spending more money at night and on the weekends than they are during the day, so you're trying to bring in residents to downtown areas to create sales tax support. Now, all of this is going to be relatively more important in the current post-crisis period than it was before. And that's because of the work-from-home changes that we heard about in the last presentation. As there's less people, relatively speaking, or at the very least, less demand by some types of offices for downtown areas, it's going to be more important, relatively speaking, that those same areas can attract residential density. But we can't lose sight of establishment density. We can't lose sight of establishment density, first of all, because of the tax receipts, the tax benefits of that kind of density. But also, when we're talking about dynamism in urban areas, business travelers make a big difference. Business travelers make a big difference because they bring expense accounts, they bring demand for hotels, convention centers, these sorts of things. And if you can build up an establishment base in an area, an establishment base especially a producer services like law offices and accounting offices, then you can also create a demand by business travelers to come into those areas for meetings and interactions. We also can't lose sight of new businesses. New businesses tend to form where old businesses are. They tend to want to trade with old businesses. And so if we want the new and most exciting parts of the economy to be located in the urban areas of the Inland Empire, we need to think about how to establish current levels of establishment density to draw those in. And this is going to be relatively less important post-2020, but it will not be important. It will continue to be important to have a tax base and all these other things as we move forward. And I do want to point out that we don't have to have as our model a New York or a Chicago or a Seattle when we're thinking about how to build establishment and residential density in the Inland Empire. Orange County has been able to generate certain levels in small areas of establishment and residential density, and they can be a model. We can do it better. We can do it bigger and better here in a relatively suburban area than Orange County did. Now I want to talk about how. I want to talk about the actual levers that we might be able to push right now as a region that does not quite have the establishment density or residential density that we want in order to get where we want to be, and that is a major league metropolitan area. It's very tricky, actually, to think about how to strategize around density, because density is a kind of chicken and egg problem. For one, as I've said already, residential and establishment density tend to go together. You get residential density when there's a lot of jobs. You get establishment density when there's a lot of residents, because jobs want to be near residents and residents want to be near jobs. In terms of the actual mechanisms towards getting density in a region, I want to talk first about anchors. And the reason why I want to talk about anchors is because they help to resolve this chicken and egg problem. Well, what's an anchor? An anchor is a big establishment like a university or like the headquarters of a corporation that can immediately draw in workers, and those workers can immediately demand housing around where they work. So traditionally, government jobs have been very attractive anchors. And when you look at some of the anchors that currently exist in the Inland Empire, you find that the government has provided a lifeline. Governments like the County of Riverside or the County of San Bernardino. However, these aren't enough. Government anchors will not be sufficient for generating the kind of dynamism that I've been describing, because they have fixed schedules, because they have low growth potential, because they have less spin-off potential. What all of this means is that the size of the government is basically constrained by the number of people you have in a local area. There won't tend to be more government or additional governments spinning off from the existing government. So there is not that forward-thinking dynamism. A suitable anchor will be non-governmental, not necessarily for-profit, but non-governmental. It will employ more than 500 full-time staff, and it will have strong linkages to the local business community. Now, another anchor that's traditionally supported the development of downtown areas is the retail sector. So initially this was markets. This goes back the whole history of cities, but there's also been department stores and malls. The Inland Empire learned relatively early, 40, 30 years ago, that retail doesn't last forever, that you can't, for time immemorial, build a downtown around department stores. Department stores used to be a much bigger part of San Bernardino's urban life, and they no longer are. Increasingly, as we heard from Tanner's presentation, other areas are learning this lesson, that the switch to e-tail from retail is going to lead to certain shocks in the economy. So as the city of San Bernardino, the city of Riverside or Ontario look to anchors and identify anchors that can support new rounds of density in their urban cores, they need to look to other amenities, wages and income, and residences in order to do this. Now, luckily, you aren't starting from scratch in the Inland Empire. There are 3 natural anchors corresponding with 3 already strong urban centers in the Inland Empire of Riverside, San Bernardino, and Ontario. And luckily, from the standpoint of stamping out some of the unhelpful urban factionalism that you see in some economic development projects, these anchors sort of complement each other more than they do compete with each other. So you've got this fantastic anchor that I'm delivering this presentation from at the University of California, Riverside. In Riverside, you've got the county seat in San Bernardino. You've got the airport in Ontario. These are major employment anchors that can help to strengthen density in and around these urban economies. And an anchor-driven strategy is going to figure out ways to provide linkages between the downtown areas and these anchors. One example of an anchor-driven strategy might be to ensure that new dorm development at UCR is anchored to the downtown area. You get dorm rooms, you get college students in a downtown area, you're already going to make that area a more 24/7 and vibrant area. So the city of Riverside and the region of the Inland Empire can look to its current assets in order to generate some of its density. But we can't just rely on outside saviors in the form of anchors to do some of this, to do all of this densifying for us. Public safety is important. And when we talk once again about the currently most dense area of the Inland Empire right now, what we have is an area that is significantly less safe than other downtowns, even in the density cohort of San Bernardino, and even more less safe than leading downtown areas across the country. At the center, we did a small study among the 100 most underperforming downtowns, and we found that crime per capita is associated negatively with establishment density. So what you want to do in order to turn the ship around is do the things you can to get more eyes on the street. This can sometimes take the form of ambassador programs in downtown areas where you pay for more people to monitor the street. The great urbanist Jane Jacobs emphasized eyes on the street as a precondition of safe urban areas. And you can look to case study evidence as well. We identified in our research Cary, North Carolina, as a exemplar of making an area more safe. Its establishment density grew by 21% between 2007 and 2016, and its crime fell by around the same amount, 20%, in that same period. So there isn't a complete cause and effect here. Some of this is a chicken or egg problem, but clearly some part of the turnaround of Cary, North Carolina had to do with public safety, and anchors didn't help either. There are 3 strong anchors in SAS, MetLife, and Verizon in that city. Finally, I want to return to producer services. It's been a small theme throughout this presentation, but when we want to talk about having more establishments per square mile in a downtown area, what we're really talking about are producer services. Sometimes these jobs are called FIRE, finance, insurance, and real estate. There's other acronyms for them, but it's really important to have in mind the consumers of density when you want to build more density. Now, this is especially true in legal services, but unfortunately, things are moving in the wrong direction in downtown San Bernardino for legal services. The number of downtown law offices, based on our study of the topic, actually dropped from 56 to 31 between 2009 and 2019. Whether or not this has to do with public safety or something else is the subject of a research project we'd like to pursue, but it's clearly a troubling development from the standpoint of developing more density. And it's also troubling development for the hospitality and service businesses in downtown San Bernardino that would service law offices. Ultimately, and some of you might laugh at me saying this, there aren't enough lawyers in downtown San Bernardino. San Bernardino is not making the most of its current assets, its current anchor, which is its county seat. Fewer lawyers downtown in San Bernardino than even in Riverside, and even in Riverside, there's not a ton of lawyers downtown. And maybe most troublingly of all, if you look at all the lawyers in San Bernardino County, only 25%, 1/4, are in the city of San Bernardino at all. So in order to build density, you can start to think about building more law offices, targeting directly lawyers and other producer services to come downtown. I could go on. There are different areas of the playbook to increase density that we haven't explored yet, but time is short, and I think I should just go back to talking about basketball and Major League sports. The Milwaukee basketball team, the Milwaukee Bucks, happened to win the championship this year because they had a guy named Giannis Antetokounmpo powering their offense and defense. Giannis Antetokounmpo is a rangy 7-footer who started playing basketball late in life, but was kind of always meant to be a basketball player, if not a professional basketball player. And lo and behold, he was. For the same reason, the Inland Empire is kind of meant to have a major downtown or 3. It's got 5 million people. It's got over 1 million jobs. It is a major economy in the country. However, it does not quite have the place, it does not quite have the urban environments necessary to sustain density and sustain some of the wonderful things about urbanism. We need to embrace density as a goal, spark it with anchors, public safety, producer services, and other things that I haven't had time to talk about. And then we need to watch what happens. It's going to be great. Pass the popcorn.